Imagine New York City, the year 1883. You're strolling down Fifth Avenue. Carriages are rolling by pulled by horses that are fanning themselves with their tails because it's hot and they re-exhausted. You pass by mansions whose windows are glowing with electricity, light spilling out onto the sidewalk and reflecting off the newly paved streets. Up above, Mrs. Astor is throwing yet another dinner party. Her famous 400 have arrived and the menu has 17 courses. Just to show off, they eat turtle soup and drink vintage champagne. Outside, a ragtime band plays for your amusement. And you can't help but feel like this is the greatest city on earth. But here's the thing, that was true. New York was amazing. It was also rotten. Because when you think Gilded Age, you're thinking luxury. You're thinking parties, you're thinking beautiful buildings. But the Gilded and Gilded Age wasn't just about luxury. It was about hiding the rot underneath. Because if you wanted to see what was really going on in New York, all you had to do was look up, way up. What do you see? Mansions, right? Well, keep walking. What do you see? There's an apartment building, but you don't want to go in there. Don't go in there. Look away. Keep walking. Go down one more block. What do you see now? Another apartment building. Come on, let's go down one more block. What do you see? There it is. This is what you came to see. This is New York's secret. These buildings were called tenements, and they were made for profit. They didn't have elevators or even, often, windows. They were just bricks and mortar and quick cash. Developers figured if they put 4 or 5 or 6 stories up, they could rent those floors to poor folks moving into the city. And these folks, mostly immigrants from Ireland or Italy or Germany or Eastern Europe, they had little choice but to move in. Here, imagine you're arriving in America. You dream of freedom. You dream of opportunity. You land in New York? Where are you gonna stay? You don't know anybody here. Your cousin says, "Hey, come stay with me." So you go down to the basement of his tenement, which he shares with 2 other guys he doesn't even know and 11 others. You repacked in like sardines and the air is thick with chamber pots and the smell of stale waste. And the rat. Oh yeah, and the rats. Outside, Mrs. Astor is hosting her famous balls. Inside, you're fighting to breathe. A cough goes around and soon you're sick with tuberculosis. No matter, there's always work. In the factories, the shops, the fields, you work until you drop. Then you head back to the tenement. There's your cousin, same dark basement, 11 relatives, 2 strangers. Maybe now you're sharing a bed. You have no privacy. You can't even open a window without letting in a draft of coal dust or plaster or the stench from the nearby horse stables. And still, New Yorkers, the rich ones anyway, call this progress. The poor call it survival. And the city's official stance? Out of sight, out of mind. Those fancy buildings on Fifth Avenue were far enough away from the tenements that the rich never had to see them. And when they did turn their eyes away, they saw not poverty, they saw progress. They saw a growing economy, a bustling city, a new era for the United States. The U.S. was becoming a world power and New York was leading the charge. By the end of the century, New York had nearly 2 million residents, 370 of them millionaires. The city was booming and everyone wanted to get in on the action. But there was just one problem: where were they gonna live? The city wasn't prepared for this many people. There weren't enough houses. There wasn't enough space. There wasn't even enough food. Welcome to our channel. We have fresh content 7 days a week. So if you love this episode, subscribe for more. Tenement, noun. A building in which the individual apartments are extremely run down, overcrowded, and usually have very low rent. The word sounds like it could describe a rundown farm building or maybe an abandoned shack in the woods. But no, it's actually a synonym for hell. Step inside a tenement and you quickly realize the word home didn't apply. These buildings were often just 25 feet wide but stretched up 6 stories, crammed with as many as 20 families per floor. That meant hundreds of people living in a single building. Rooms were dark, windowless, and poorly ventilated, perfect conditions for diseases to thrive. A typical family rented 1 room. Not an apartment, just a single room where they cooked, ate, slept, worked, and gave birth. Privacy? Forget it. Children slept head to toe on straw mattresses. Boarders rented out corners of the floor. Some families even turned to the rooftops or fire escapes during summer just to breathe fresher air. Bathrooms, a single outdoor privy or shared outhouse, often overflowing. Running water, maybe one pump for the whole building, and the water was usually contaminated. Heat in the winter. If you couldn't afford coal, you froze. Fire hazards were constant wooden staircases, and candlelight meant one spark could turn the whole building into a death trap. Yet landlords raked in profits, collecting rent from hundreds of tenants while investing nothing in safety. To call it slum housing almost feels too polite. It was survival stacked on top of survival, each floor more suffocating than the last. And yet people kept moving into tenements because the alternative was usually worse, whether it was being evicted from your home or dying of starvation. There are two main reasons why. One is that cities were growing faster than they could accommodate new housing. Factories were pumping out jobs and wealth, but not enough homes. People kept flooding into cities hoping to get rich, only to find themselves stuck in a tenement. The other reason is that tenements were all that most people could afford. The Industrial Revolution had brought about unprecedented wealth, but also unprecedented poverty. And what did poor families do when they couldn't pay their rent? They became squatters. Landlords hated this, but they couldn't always stop it because there were so many people looking for cheap housing. So landlords would turn their buildings into tenements, renting out every square inch to whoever could afford it. Here's another way to think of it. You know how today the richest people get to live in mansions with white picket fences and swimming pools? Well, back then those same people lived in tenements too. It was just a different time and a different neighborhood. Tenements might sound like old news. After all, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, something our grandparents used to tell us about. But really, tenements were just the first step in a long line of terrible housing situations, including slums, public housing projects, and modern gentrification. In fact, some places that look like tenements today are actually former tenements that have been renovated. Every time a new neighborhood gets built, someone wants to tear it down and put up another skyscraper somewhere else. Overcrowding and poverty may be part of the problem, but there will always be someone who profits off of them. Conditions were so bad in the tenements that it led to a series of reforms. Eventually, cities started creating new housing codes, regulating how many people could live in a building and how much rent landlords could charge. Then, in the 1930s, New York passed the first law in the nation requiring every apartment to have a bathroom. Though these reforms were important, they didn't always work. Many landlords simply ignored them, bribing city officials or intimidating tenants. Plus, these laws mostly applied to new buildings. Most existing tenements were grandfathered in, meaning they didn't have to follow new rules. Even today, there are still 2 million people living in buildings like this across the United States. So next time you hear someone say that immigrants should go back to whatever country they came from, remember that some of those people might be living in conditions that are just as bad as the ones they escaped. And some of those people might be your neighbors. One of the greatest dangers of tenement life wasn't just the filth around you, it was the water you drank. Now we think of New York City as having some of the strictest health codes and the best drinking water in the world. Back in the late 19th century, things were very different. New York's tenements often relied on courtyard pumps or shallow wells for water. The problem was, those wells were dug right next to cesspools and garbage heaps. So every bucket of water was basically a mystery soup of bacteria. When cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread through the tenement like wildfire, it wasn't hard to see why thousands upon thousands died each season. Boiling water could kill the germs, but not every family had the fuel to do that or the time. They needed that water for cleaning, cooking, and yes, drinking. Even the milk that was sold by street vendors was watered down with that same contaminated liquid. If you were poor, every meal came with a side of potential death. For the wealthy uptown, food was served on silver platters. Downtown, it was a different story. Meat was left out in the open-air markets, exposed to the flies which carried diseases from the garbage to your dinner plate. People got sick from eating spoiled cuts of meat. In tenement kitchens, there wasn't always enough food or clean dishes. Kids would eat off the floor or share plates that were never washed. Food poisoning was common. And when push came to shove, a family's greatest fear was going hungry. By the 1860s and 70s, newspaper reporters and reformers began pointing out that clean water could save lives. But city officials moved at a snail's pace. They didn't want to spend money on building water lines in immigrant neighborhoods, not when they could just keep the streets clean. And even then, what could be done? Cleaning up the streets would then stop the garbage and human waste from piling up in the air shafts and stairwells. In the end, people drank poison daily simply because they had no choice. That's 1 minute. See you tomorrow. If the water didn't get you, the air would. Tenements were built for profit, not for health. And inside those four walls, ventilation was almost non-existent. Imagine 50 people cooking, sweating, coughing, sleeping in a single corridor with no windows. The smell alone was enough to make you nauseous. But the real killer was tuberculosis, known as the White Plague. It thrived in these cramped, damp, dark spaces. Doctors even described tenements as death traps where disease spread faster than anywhere else in the city. Families shared the same air, the same beds, even the same drinking cups. One sick person meant an entire building could be infected. Infants and children rarely stood a chance. So, I wanted to show you these two kids playing, but it's really hard to do that when they're dead. When Jacob Reese visited this particular tenement, he saw 3 dead children lying around. He asked the mother, "How did they die?" She replied, "They just died. The chill must have gotten into them." In this case, the chill literally did get into them. But for most kids on the street, there wasn't enough fresh air or sunshine. They were doomed from the start. 50% of babies born in tenements died before their 2nd birthday. That's 1 out of every 2. To put that in perspective, between 1860 and 1900, only about 13% of Manhattan babies died in that age range. Yeah, that's still terrible. But it was a lot better than being born in a tenement. And if you survived infancy, you probably wouldn't die young anyway, because childhood was a lot safer in the suburbs. Back in the city, the air grew thicker and more dangerous as the decades passed. By the 1890s, New York had 1.2 million people living in tenements. For the first time in American history, more people lived in cities than in rural areas. What was once a village had become a teeming metropolis. Streets were jammed with pedestrians and traffic. Horse manure piled up everywhere. People breathed it in along with the smoke from factories and coal stoves. Garbage often sat outside buildings, sometimes for weeks on end. The stench was unbearable, especially in the summer heat. And don't forget the open sewers and the streets. Disease spread through the air and water, through rats and roaches. Typhoid Mary, who worked as a cook, infected dozens of families that way. She was so contagious that health officials forcibly quarantined her for the last 23 years of her life. And while all that stuff is pretty gross, I think what really makes tenements so creepy is the thought of those long, dark halls with barely any fresh air. If you were a kid, you'd probably get bored and start playing. You'd run up and down the stairs or kick a ball down the hall. Maybe you'd even play hide and seek. The older kids would hide in the closets, but the little ones would hide in the windows. Wait, no, they wouldn't because there aren't any. As you're watching them play, you can't help but think that they shouldn't be here. That they should be out on a playground or in a park somewhere, anywhere but here. This isn't a place for kids. It's too dangerous. And the worst part is, they're gonna get sick. Some of them won't make it. Their friends will get sick too, and then their friends will die. The air in the tenements killed more people than the water ever did, but both were equally preventable. The city that promised opportunity ended up delivering suffocation for the poor. Skyscrapers might have been going up, but for tenement dwellers, they just meant less sunlight ever reached their windows. Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this episode. I'm one of the co-creators of this series. If you want to learn how you can help us keep this content free for everyone forever, you can visit our support page. Until next time, thanks for watching. Hey, welcome to my channel. This is an old-timey cartoon of what it was like to walk down a street in New York City's famous tenement district. Yeah, those buildings over there with the fire escapes, but more on that later. Now, here's your narrator. Let's go back in time and check out the slums of New York City. Imagine you survived the trip over here from Europe. You got off the boat with a few bucks in your pocket, some high hopes, and the clothes on your back? Your first stop is the nearest tenement district, because that's where the cheapest rooms are and you gonna need a place to stay while you get settled and start looking for work. Well, here we are. Now let's go inside. Okay, so you found a room in a tenement building. What's that like? Well, picture this. Your room is about 12 by 12 feet. It has one window that doesn't open and 3 walls, one of which has a built-in closet and sink. That's it. You have no private bathroom, of course. That's in the hall down the way. And it's shared by about 20 other people on your floor alone. The water comes on at certain hours of the day and the place is always filthy. The air is thick with garbage and human waste, the latter of which is sometimes dumped right in the streets outside. Oh, yeah. And did I mention the rats? They're everywhere, fat and happy, rooting around in the garbage, making their way into your room through cracks in the walls. You learn to fight them off with whatever you can, but it's a losing battle. They breed in the walls and nobody bothers to stop them. Sleep is a luxury you don't often get in the city, what with the nearby factories running late into the night. The drunken arguments of your neighbors and their crying babies. Ah, and the music. Oh, the music. Your Italian neighbors are having a nice little party. They've been at it since 8 o'clock and they're just getting warmed up. Yeah, the music's great, but the smell is something else again. The garbage in the streets, the stale waste in the rooms, the chamber pots, the sewage. It all mingles in a thick soup of stench that clings to your clothes and hair. It's a smell of death, some have said. A smell that screams misery. The tenement districts were the absolute worst. Place to live in New York City, but they didn't keep people away. In fact, immigrants kept coming here in droves. Why? Because they had no other choice? They needed cheap places to stay while they got on their feet and started earning a decent wage. There were some rare bright spots, though. Immigrants tended to stick together. So, no matter where you came from, you could find people who shared your language and customs. Italians had their clubs, Irish their churches, Jews their synagogues. These places gave people a much-needed sense of community, a chance to celebrate their heritage, a little piece of home in a sea of grime and poverty. There was music and dancing at the clubs, religious services in the churches, festivals in the streets. These were the anchors that kept people going, the festivals, the friends, the familiar faces. They were the only things that could pull you out of the crushing misery that threatened to engulf you on every side. Of course, there were plenty of people who never made it out, who simply succumbed to the crushing weight of life in the tenements. There were so many people living in such close quarters that sickness spread like wildfire. When the sanitation department finally did come by, it was too late. Smallpox, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, they all flourished in the crowded, grimy rooms and spread like wildfire through the poor neighborhoods. Life was cheap in the cities and death was even cheaper. It took the threat of a major epidemic to finally force the city's leaders to do something about the sanitation crisis. They knew the tenements were bad, but they didn't do anything about it because, well, those people basically didn't vote, so they didn't care. So now you know why walking down a street in New York City's tenement district was a fate worse than death. At least you could avoid death. But the stench, oh man, the stench was inescapable. In fact, New Yorkers joked that you could smell a tenement street before you saw it, and they weren't kidding. Thanks for watching. How did immigrants make New York City what it is today? That's what we're exploring in this series. And previous episodes are available now. By the 1860s, New York City was being transformed by waves of immigrants fleeing persecution and poverty in Europe. These newcomers were funneling into the city's slums, places like the infamous 5 Points, which became synonymous with urban poverty and despair. There were other neighborhoods like this all over the city, filled with buildings housing thousands of people in squalid conditions. They were called tenements. And while there had been some efforts to reform them, life for the immigrants living in these neighborhoods was still miserable. It took outsiders to shine a light on the misery. In 1890, journalist Jacob Riis published a book called How the Other Half Lives. It contained shocking photographs of tenement horrors, not just for their filth and dim oil lamp lighting, but also because they showed how close these slums were to the mansions of the wealthy. Suddenly, the rich could unpretend they did know what was happening just a few blocks from their homes. Reform followed slowly. Laws were passed requiring windows in every room, safer construction, and better sanitation. The Tenement House Act of 1901 was one of the most significant, demanding improvements like indoor plumbing and fire safety. But even then, landlords resisted and enforcement was weak. For most of the immigrants living in tenements, leaving wasn't an option. Families saved every penny, hoping to eventually move uptown or out to Brooklyn. Children grew up in cramped, disease-filled rooms, but many carried their parents' dreams of escape in their hearts. For them, the tenements were more than just a neighborhood. They were a temporary home base in a larger battle against poverty. The struggle to improve living conditions in New York's tenements was long and slow. But by the early 20th century, conditions had improved dramatically. The city began investing in parks, playgrounds, and public schools in immigrant neighborhoods. And by the 1930s, most tenements had been replaced by low-rise apartment buildings with better access to sunlight and air, but the scars of tenement life were permanent. They were places of misery, yes, but also of survival, resilience, and the foundation of New York's working class. The Gilded Age glittered on top, but in the shadows, the tenements told the real story, progress built on suffering. Our series on the history of New York City is produced in partnership with a digital studio. Their mission is to create the best historical documentaries and series in partnership with museums and archives across the globe. This series is hosted by me. Our production team is led by Greg Williams, and our coordinating producer is Alyssa Gendelev. I'm the curator of collections at a museum where innovation meets the immigrant experience. Our collections contain over 40,000 artifacts, photographs, and oral histories documenting the incredible stories of immigrants who came to New York seeking new lives in a new world. Many of these objects came from the communities we've been talking about in this series. If you'd like to learn more about our collections, visit our website.